She had traveled 6 days on a train to reach a town that had already decided she was worth nothing. She stood on that platform with every eye watching, waiting to see if the man who had chosen her would change his mind. He did not change his mind. Instead, Will Calhoun turned to face the crowd and said the words that would define everything that followed. This is the story of what happened next. The letter arrived on a Thursday. The same morning, Will Calhoun buried a calf that had not survived the night, and he read it standing at the kitchen table in muddy boots, with the kind of tiredness in his bones that sleep no longer fixed. The handwriting belonged to Agnes Burke of the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency in Denver, and the language was careful in that particular way that told a man the writer was nervous about something she had not yet said directly. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table, poured the coffee that had been sitting too long on the stove, and read it a third time. The substance of it was this: Agnes Burke wanted to give him one final opportunity to reconsider his chosen match. Several community members in Millstone Creek had reached out to the agency in recent days, expressing concerns about the suitability of the arrangement. She used phrases like professional responsibility and the welfare of the children and the particular circumstances of your chosen candidate. She had taken the liberty, she wrote, of preparing the file of an alternative match, a younger woman from Cheyenne, and she enclosed that file with the letter. Will did not open the enclosed file. He understood what Agnes Burke was saying without the wrapping of her careful language. His chosen bride could not have children. That fact, disclosed honestly and completely in her initial application, had been buried in a footnote that 3 previous men had discovered and quietly used as their exit. The agency had placed it in a footnote because Agnes Burke had hoped it would go unnoticed long enough for the arrangement to carry its own momentum. It had not gone unnoticed in Millstone Creek either, which meant someone in this town had gone to considerable trouble to reach a letter-writing woman in Denver and ensure that the information moved in the right direction. Will had a very clear idea of who that someone was. He looked at the 5 photographs pinned to the wall beside the kitchen window. School portraits, each one taken at the schoolhouse in Millstone Creek at the start of term, each one dated in the teacher's handwriting at the bottom corner. Ethan at 12 already carrying his father's jaw and his mother's dark eyes, already looking like a man who has been given too much to hold. Cole at 9, his expression flat in the photograph in the way that a flat expression is never truly flat, but rather a lid pressed down over something hot. Owen at 7, staring at something just past the photographer's shoulder, as though the thing worth looking at existed slightly to the left of the ordinary world. And the twins, 5 years old, Noah, grinning with the full commitment of a child who does not know, yet that grins can become complicated. And Lily with her hand pressed to her cheek and her eyes doing something that photographs did not capture well, but which Will knew from the living version was the look she got when she was trying very hard not to cry and was not quite succeeding. He picked up his pen. He wrote, "My mind has not changed, Mrs. Burke. 5 children need a mother. I need help. Miss Hayes needs a home where she will not be judged for something she cannot control. That seems like an arrangement that works for everyone. Do not write to me again about this." He sealed the envelope, rode to town before the sun was fully up, and posted it without speaking to anyone he did not have to speak to. The town of Millstone Creek knew things the way all small towns knew things, which was to say thoroughly and selectively, and with the particular speed that information achieved when it had somewhere important to go. 400 souls occupied the basin and the surrounding ranches, connected by wagon roads and shared wells, and the kind of accumulated mutual observation that created over years a map of everyone's business precise enough to navigate by. The information about Will Calhoun's mail-order bride had been moving through that map for 3 weeks. The source was Mrs. Harriet Weston, 61 years old, widow of Howard Weston, who had built the first bank in Millstone Creek and whose money still shaped the town the way a riverbed shapes water, invisibly but completely. Harriet was not a cruel woman in the way that cruelty announces itself. She was something more durable than cruel. She was certain. She had organized her understanding of the world into categories that had served her for 6 decades, and within those categories she knew what women were for and what a woman's failure to fulfill her primary function meant about her fitness for anything else. She had also had a plan. The plan involved her niece Ruth Weston, 22 years old, and capable in the ordinary ways presented to Will Calhoun at 4 separate social occasions over the past year, with the careful repetition of a woman making a case she expects will eventually be heard. Will had attended each occasion, been courteous to Ruth, and given no indication whatsoever that he understood what was being offered. When word reached Harriet that Will had written to a matrimonial agency, she had allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic. When word reached her that he had selected a barren widow from Connecticut over every other available woman in the territory, the word she used privately was not a word she used publicly, but its effects were very public indeed. Within 48 hours of learning the facts, Harriet had communicated 3 pieces of information to every woman of standing in Millstone Creek. That Clara Hayes could not have children, that she had been rejected effectively by her late husband's own family after his death, and that whatever possessed a man of Will Calhoun's experience to make such an arrangement was very likely the same grief-impaired judgment that had led him to let the ranch deteriorate in the months after Margaret died. Harriet wrote to Agnes Burke because it was the practical thing to do. She genuinely believed the arrangement was wrong. She genuinely believed the children deserved better. She genuinely believed that her concern was the driving force behind everything she did. This is what made her dangerous in a way that simple malice would not have been. Clara Hayes had been on trains for 6 days. She was sitting in the second-class car with her one trunk in the luggage compartment, her carpet bag on the seat beside her, her mother's Bible in her lap, and the letter folded against her left palm, where she had been holding it for 3 states and most of Wyoming. The letter was soft at the folds from handling. She had read it so many times that she could have reconstructed it word by word from memory, but she kept unfolding it anyway. It was the letter where Will Calhoun had addressed the question she had not quite been able to ask directly. She had written to him with the formal care of someone who understood that this was probably her last available chance and who did not want to arrive at the end of it based on a misunderstanding. She had written, Mr. Calhoun, I want to be certain you have read my full file, including the disclosure in the supplementary notes regarding my medical history. I would not want to arrive under any misapprehension. He had written back, Miss Hayes, I have read every word. I am not looking for a broodmare. I am looking for a good woman who will be patient with children who are hurting. If that is something you can do, that is all I need. Everything else is nobody's business but ours. She had cried for 20 minutes after reading that letter. She considered this an inauspicious beginning to a business correspondence and had told no one about it. Outside the train window, Wyoming unrolled itself in great red and ochre expanses, and Clara, who had grown up in Hartford among elms and brownstones and the comfortable enclosure of the Connecticut River Valley, felt the size of this place as something physical, a pressure against the chest that was either agoraphobia or awe, and possibly both at once. The sky here was not sky the way Connecticut sky was sky. It was something else entirely, something that did not leave room for small thinking. She tried to inventory what she knew about the man she was traveling toward. His letters had been spare functional honest in the way that a man is honest when he has decided there is no point in being otherwise. He had told her about the children by name and age in a single identifying characteristic each, as though he was giving her a working briefing rather than a family portrait. He had told her what the ranch required and what he could offer in return. He had not told her how Margaret died, only that she had died of fever, and Clara had not pressed the point because she understood that some information belonged to its carrier until the carrier chose to release it. What she knew when she reduced it to essentials: he was 36, he worked hard, he had 5 children who were in pain, and he had read her file completely and not withdrawn. In the arithmetic of Clara Hayes's life at 24, those facts added up to something she had not had much access to. She straightened her dress, which was dark blue wool and slightly too warm for May, but which was the best she owned. She checked her hair, which had required 40 minutes and several additional pins this morning, and which she suspected would not survive the arrival in its current state. She picked up her carpet bag. The train was slowing into Millstone Creek. He was at the far end of the platform. Clara saw him before he saw her, which gave her a moment she had not expected. He was tall, considerably over 6 feet, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who spend most of their time outdoors, who have made peace with waiting because waiting is simply part of the work. He held his hat in his hands. His clothes were clean and well kept. His hair was showing the first threads of gray at the temples, which his portrait in the agency file had not captured and which Clara found she liked better than the portrait. He looked up. Their eyes met across the platform with the directness of 2 people who are too tired for performance and too honest for pretense. He crossed the platform without hurrying. He removed his hat when he was close enough to speak. Miss Hayes. Mr. Calhoun. Neither of them attempted a smile. Clara had spent 2 years navigating people who smiled at her while thinking things she could feel beneath the smiling, and the absence of that particular social machinery felt like taking off boots that had been too tight. She breathed more easily than she had in 6 days on a train. He took her trunk from the porter with the economy of a man who does not waste movement, and they walked toward the wagon together. And that was when it began. Agnes Burke was standing near the hotel entrance, which was 50 feet from the wagon, and she had the expression of a woman who has been rehearsing something for several hours and is not entirely confident in her material. She was shorter than Clara had imagined, and sweatier, and she was already speaking before they reached her. The architecture of what Agnes Burke said, stripped of its considerable scaffolding, was this: she had received communications from members of the community expressing concern. There were questions about the suitability of this particular match for a household with young children. She had brought the file of an alternative candidate, a woman from Cheyenne with no complications, and she wanted to provide Will with the opportunity to review it before any final decisions were made. She did not quite finish the sentence. Will Calhoun did not raise his voice. He did not step toward Agnes Burke in any way that could be called threatening. He simply stopped walking and spoke in a tone that carried quietly and completely across the platform and the small crowd of townspeople who had found reasons to be nearby. Mrs. Burke, this woman traveled 6 days on a train based on an agreement she made in good faith. She told the truth about herself in her application when she had every reason to conceal it and knew that the truth might cost her the match. She met every requirement your agency sets out, and you are standing on this platform suggesting I send her back because some people in this town have decided to have opinions about her medical history. He paused. Here is what is going to happen. Miss Hayes is coming home with me. She is going to meet my children. She is going to decide whether she wants this arrangement, because that is a decision that belongs to her. And if I hear that you have said one more word to anyone in Millstone Creek about her complications, I will make it my business to ensure that every ranching family in this territory knows exactly how the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency treats the women it claims to represent. He turned to Clara. The wagon is this way, Miss Hayes, if you still want to come. The crowd on the platform was very quiet. Agnes Burke was the color of old paper. Clara could feel, every eye could feel the weight of the assessment happening around her, the same weight she had stood under in Hartford when Robert's mother held court at the funeral and made certain everyone present understood the location of the marriage's failure. But Will Calhoun was looking at her with gray eyes that contained no pity whatsoever. Only a direct and uncomplicated question. She thought this man just defended me to an entire town, and he did not do it because he felt sorry for me. He did it because he thought it was the correct thing to do. Yes, she said, I would like that very much. She did not look back at Agnes Burke. She did not look back at the crowd. She walked beside Will Calhoun to the wagon, and when he helped her up onto the bench seat with a brief and businesslike hand at her elbow, she settled her carpet bag at her feet and let Millstone Creek Station fall away behind the wagon wheels. The road from town to the Calhoun Ranch covered 8 miles of Wyoming basin country, and it took them the better part of 2 hours, which gave Clara and Will Calhoun something neither of them had planned on: time to talk without an audience and without the pressure of any immediate task. Will drove with the ease of someone who had made this journey enough times that his hands knew it without instruction. He spoke first, which surprised her slightly. She had expected more silence. He told her things he had not put in his letters. Margaret had not died of fever in the general sense. She had died of typhoid, and he still found the specific word difficult to produce cleanly, so that it came out with a slight catch he did not seem entirely aware of. The distinction mattered to him in a way he did not explain, and Clara did not ask him to. She understood that certain words for certain things were like wounds you had learned to avoid touching, but had not healed around. He described the year following Margaret's death in the factual way that people describe things they are still too close to see entirely. The children had been managed by a rotation of neighboring women who brought meals and checked on the house, which was generous and unsustainable, and which had left the household in a state of patchwork management that he had not been able to correct because the ranch demanded his full attention or failed. And failure meant losing the thing Margaret had spent 12 years building alongside him. He talked about each child separately And Clara listened with the kind of attention she gave to things that mattered, which meant she was quiet, and she did not fill pauses, and she asked questions that were specific rather than sympathetic. He told her that Ethan had appointed himself the household's commanding officer in the absence of adults who could fill the role, and that this had been both necessary and damaging in the way that children carrying adult burdens always were damaged without anyone intending it. He told her that Cole was 9 years old and had chosen anger as his method of surviving grief, which was not the easiest method, but was, in Will's private estimation, healthier than the alternative. The alternative was Owen, who had barely spoken since they lowered Margaret into the ground at the churchyard, and who Will watched every day with a fear he could not name, but recognized in the particular way you recognize things you had never encountered before but had always known existed. He told her about the twins. Noah was 5 years old and treated the world as an extended opportunity for connection, which meant he had not yet developed the mechanisms that made loss sustainable, but which also meant he had a resilience born of radical openness. Lily was 5 years old and asked for her mother every night before sleep, and Will had run out of answers that did not feel like failures. Clara listened to all of this. Then she told him about Hartford in the condensed and selective way you told your history to a stranger before it became something you owed them the full version of. She had married at 20 because it was what came next in the logical progression of a young woman from a decent family in a city where young women from decent families followed progressions. Robert Hayes had been a reasonable man. She had liked him genuinely, which was more than many women could say, and she had been faithful and domestic and hopeful in the ways that young wives were supposed to be hopeful. And then the midwife's pronouncement, confirmed by a second physician, and Robert's mother discovering the information with the efficiency of a woman who had been looking for something exactly like it. And then Robert's death, which had nothing to do with any of it, and which had still somehow been organized into a narrative in which Clara's deficiency was the silent cause. And then the years of being a widow in a city where widows without money or children or families were neither fish nor fowl, too old for the category of eligible and too young for the category of matron, present in every room and invisible in all of them. She did not tell him that she had cried over his letter. She did not tell him that the phrase "that is all I need" had felt like being given water after years of standing in dust. "There," Will said, and pointed ahead through the early dusk. Clara looked. Against the darkening sky, warm yellow light was already burning in the windows of a house that resolved as the wagon drew closer into something larger than she had imagined. 2 stories wide fronted porch, wrapping the front and one side solidly built from timber and stone in the way that buildings in this country were built when they were meant to last. The neglect of 18 months was visible even in the failing light, a shutter hanging loose on its hinge weeds pushing up through the porch, steps paint peeling at the eaves, but underneath all of that, underneath the evidence of a house that had lost the person who loved it most attentively, she could see the bones of something that had been built with care and intention. A house that remembered what it was before grief moved in. The front door opened before the wagon had fully stopped, and the children came out in a sequence that told Clara everything she needed to know about who each of them was before any of them said a word. Lily came first, running down the porch steps with the complete physical commitment of a 5-year-old who has seen her father's wagon and will not wait 1 second longer than necessary. She ran past the loose board on the 3rd step, past the weeds, past everything between her and what she wanted, and Will was down from the wagon in one motion and caught her, swinging her up against his chest and pressing his face into her dark hair with something so unguarded that Clara looked away for a moment to give them the privacy of it. Noah came right behind his sister, already talking, before he had cleared the porch, announcing that Ethan had burned the cornbread again, and that Cole had said something Noah was not supposed to repeat, but desperately wanted to, and that Owen had been sitting by the window for an hour, and it was strange even for Owen. Cole was standing at the top of the porch steps, arms crossed, jaw set, 9 years old and already in possession of a stillness that was not peace but its opposite, the stillness of someone holding something down by force of will. He looked at Clara with the flat evaluation of someone who has decided before the evidence arrives that the verdict will be unfavorable. Owen was in the doorway, one hand on the frame. His eyes moved across everything with a quality of attention that Clara recognized from children who had learned suddenly and completely that the world could change without warning, and who watched it now the way you watch something you no longer entirely trusted. Ethan stood at the top of the steps, one position apart from Cole, with his shoulders set in the way his father's shoulders were set, and the expression of someone who has been managing a situation and is now being asked to adjust to a variable he did not plan for. He was 12 years old and already showing the man he was going to be in the architecture of his face, and the man was going to be someone you would want on your side in difficult circumstances, but who was not going to make anything easy that he did not have to make easy. Children, Will said, with Lily settled on his hip and the rest of the family assembled before him. This is Miss Clara Hayes. She has come from back east to help run the house and look after things while I am working. I expect you to mind your manners and make her welcome. Is she going to be our new mother? Lily asked. The question fell into the evening air with the weight that only a 5-year-old's honest question carries, which is to say it fell perfectly and without apology and landed on every person present with different force. Clara watched it cross each face. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Cole's expression went the particular kind of flat that was not blankness, but rather the suppression of something specific. Owen simply turned his enormous eyes from Lily to Clara and back, reading the room with the thoroughness of a child who understood that what happened in the next few seconds mattered. Will answered carefully, Miss Hayes is here to help. That is what matters right now. Which was not a no. Clara noted that. It was not a no, and it was not a yes, and it was the answer of a man who understood that some questions deserved more time than the evening light allowed. Noah had already crossed to Clara's side of the porch and was looking up at her with the direct and uncomplicated interest of someone who has not yet learned to perform indifference. You are taller than I thought you would be, he said. That is good. James at school says tall women are better at things. I do not know if that is true, but I think it might be. Cole said from his position, with his arms still crossed, James at school does not know anything. He knows some things, Noah said unperturbed. Clara looked at all of them. She thought about what Will had told her on the wagon road, about Ethan caring too much for too long, about Cole's anger being the shape his grief had taken, about Owen's silence, about Lily asking for her mother every night. She thought about the 6 days on the train and the years before that, and the footnote in the agency file and the word barren, spoken in a Hartford parlor by a woman who had decided what Clara was worth and then made sure everyone else agreed. She thought, these are children who are hurting. This man is asking me to help them. I do not know if I can do it right, but I know I am going to try. Hello, she said. I am very glad to meet all of you. The silence that followed was the particular kind that belongs to a room full of people deciding what to do next. Ethan carried her trunk upstairs without being asked. Clara noted this as a mark in one column and noted the set of his shoulders as he carried it as a mark in the other, and followed him up the stairs to the small bedroom at the end of the hall. The room was clean, functional. A single window looking out over the front yard and the drive beyond it, where the wagon was still standing, and Will was unhitching the horses with the methodical attention of a man for whom the care of animals was a form of prayer. A bed, a dresser with a ceramic wash basin on top, a hook behind the door. Someone had made the bed with clean sheets that smelled of sun and cedar. The window was open slightly, letting in the sage-scented evening air. Ethan set the trunk down and turned. Clara had expected him to leave. He did not leave. He stood in the center of the small room with his hands at his sides and looked at her with the expression of someone who has prepared something and intends to deliver it. He spoke with the flat control of a 12-year-old who has been practicing composure for 18 months and has gotten quite good at it. He told her that he had been managing the household since his mother died. He knew where everything was kept and how everything was done and what everyone needed. He was not interested in having someone come in and change the systems he had built. His mother's things were in the attic and were not to be touched. The bedroom at the end of the other hall, his parents' room, was not to be entered. He did not expect her to stay more than a week. Clara listened to every word of this. She stood still and let him finish. Then she said, "Thank you for being honest with me. I'm going to try to do the same. I am not here to change what you have built, Ethan. I am here to help carry it. Because from where I am standing, you have been carrying it alone for a very long time, and that is too much for any person, let alone a 12-year-old boy." Ethan stared at her. She could see him recalibrating. He had prepared for argument or for the condescending warmth that adults used when they wanted to dismiss children's concerns while appearing to take them seriously. He had not prepared for being taken at his word. "Do not expect us to like you," he said finally. And then, because he was 12 and honest and had said the truest thing available to him, "Any of us." "I do not expect that," Clara said. "I just expect you to let me trip on." He left without another word. His footsteps on the stairs were careful and controlled, the footsteps of someone who had decided that discipline in small things was the only reliable hedge against the disorder of large ones. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the Wyoming dark was coming in fast the way it did at altitude, the sky going from gold to deep blue to something approaching purple at the edges. The stars were beginning. More stars than she had ever seen from Hartford, more than she had ever seen from anywhere, painting themselves across the black with a prodigality that felt almost aggressive. She pulled out the folded letter from her coat pocket. "Read it one more time." Set it on the dresser beside the wash basin. She would not go back to Hartford. She had known that before she got on the train. She knew it more completely now, sitting in this small room in a stranger's house, 8 miles from a town that had already decided what she was worth before she stepped off the platform. She washed her face in the basin, changed out of the too warm blue dress into her everyday calico, made herself presentable in the functional way that the situation required. Then she went downstairs to offer to help with whatever passed for supper in this household, and walked into the kitchen chaos of 5 children who had not had consistent adult management in 18 months and got to work. The first morning arrived with the rooster at 5:30 and the sound of an argument already in progress on the floor below. Clara dressed quickly, pulled her hair back in something that functioned, if not elegantly, and went downstairs to find the kitchen in the particular state of disaster that accumulated when a 12-year-old boy tried to manage breakfast for 4 siblings with one eye on the clock and the other on the boy who kept moving things from where they were supposed to be. The cornbread from the night before was beyond rescue. The coffee on the stove had achieved a color and consistency that suggested ambition rather than success. Cole was at the table with his arms crossed, which appeared to be his natural resting position. Owen was at the window watching something in the yard below with his still complete attention. The twins were attempting to set the table with the ratio of enthusiasm to accuracy that characterized every task Noah and Lily undertook together, which meant forks were distributed across a wide geographic area. Ethan was at the stove, spatula in hand, managing the eggs with the expression of a general defending a position he knows is untenable. "Good morning," Clara said from the doorway. 5 heads turned. The kitchen went abruptly quiet. "Pa is already out," Ethan said. His voice was neutral. "He left before sunrise. Said there is coffee in the cellar and flour in the pantry and eggs in the coop." "Thank you." Clara moved into the kitchen, assessing. She crossed to the stove without ceremony and looked at what Ethan had been working with. "May I?" she said. Ethan stepped back with the expression of a man handing over a losing position, which was to say with visible relief disguised as indifference. Clara worked the stove the way she had worked her mother's kitchen in Hartford, which was to say, without drama and without hesitation. She salvaged what could be salvaged. She started fresh where fresh was required. She dumped the coffee, which had passed the point of redemption, and began again with proper proportions and the patience that coffee demanded. Lily had attached herself to Clara's left side within the first 3 minutes, standing close enough that Clara could feel the warmth of her, and narrating what was happening on the stove with the intensity of a child who has decided to document something important. "Mama made eggs like that," Lily said. "She stirred them that way, with the fork, not the spoon." "Your mother had good technique," Clara said. Lily considered this gravely. "She was very good at eggs," she confirmed, "and at biscuits, and at the Sunday roast. She was good at most things." From across the table, in a voice designed to be heard and not addressed, "She was good at all things." That was Cole, eyes on the table, arms crossed, jaw set in the particular way that meant the words had cost him something, and he did not intend to let anyone see the cost. Clara did not look at him. She said, "She sounds like someone worth knowing about. I hope you will all tell me more when you are ready." The kitchen was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet than before. "Nathaniel at school says mail-order brides are just ladies who could not find a husband by regular means," Noah announced with the cheerful informality of someone sharing useful information he has gathered. "Noah," Ethan said sharply, "I am just saying what Nathaniel said." Nathaniel, Cole said with a contempt that was somewhat impressive from a 9-year-old, has never been right about anything in his entire life. Clara set the eggs on the table. She sat down with them, which she understood was a statement of its own. And she said, Noah, your friend Nathaniel is partly right. I am here because finding the ordinary path was not available to me. But I think most good things in this life happen because the ordinary path was not available. If it had been, you would not have something interesting to tell. Noah absorbed this. That is a good way to think about it, he decided. Owen from the window had not moved or spoken, but Clara noticed in the way she had begun to notice Owen's particular language that he had turned slightly from the glass to face the room, an adjustment of perhaps 15 degrees. In Owen's vocabulary, she was beginning to understand 15 degrees was a paragraph. Ethan said nothing through breakfast, but he ate the eggs, which were better than anything that had come out of this kitchen in weeks. And he drank the coffee, which was drinkable, and when Clara quietly redistributed the fork situation at the table without making an announcement of it, he watched her do it and did not object. Small things. Clara Hayes had learned in the years of her life that mattered most to keep very careful track of small things. Will returned from the morning's work as they were finishing. He stood in the kitchen doorway with the practiced assessment of a man who read rooms the way he read weather, and what he found was 5 children at a table, food on the table, coffee in the pot, kitchen approximately functional, no casualties visible. Miss Hayes, he said, you are up early. The rooster was very determined about it, Clara said. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one of the particular relaxation of the lines around his eyes that she was beginning to catalog alongside Owen's 15-degree adjustments as language worth learning. How did it go? We managed, Clara said. She looked at the children. Lily was drinking her milk with both hands on the cup. Noah was explaining something to Owen using his fork as a visual aid. Cole had uncrossed his arms, which she noted. Ethan was watching his father with the expression of a boy waiting to hear whether the night watch had passed without incident. Will met his son's eyes. Some message moved between them that Clara could not entirely read but recognized as the communication of a household that had been operating without an adequate number of adults for too long, a system developed under duress, and now potentially no longer required to carry the full load by itself. I need to head back out, Will said. Fence line on the north end will not hold another day. Ethan, you are with me. He looked at the others. Cold chickens and eggs. Noah, you are on wood detail. Owen. He paused in the way he paused before speaking to Owen, giving the boy the extra half-second he consistently seemed to need. Help Miss Hayes with whatever she needs. Owen nodded once, solemn and complete. Miss Hayes, Will turned at the door. If there is trouble, the bell on the back porch. 2 long rings. Otherwise, I will be back for the evening meal. We will be fine, Clara said. Will looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at things he was measuring against a standard he had not yet fully explained. Then he nodded, settled his hat, and went back out into the Wyoming morning with Ethan following in his shadow. The kitchen was quieter with them gone, but Clara stood at the stove and looked at the 3 children remaining and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she did not have an immediate name for, but which was warm and specific and had nothing to do with her own circumstances and everything to do with theirs. She said, I thought I might start with the front room today, but I could use a second opinion on where things ought to go. Owen, would you be willing to show me what your mother's arrangement was? Owen turned from the window where he had returned after breakfast. Those enormous eyes considered her. He crossed the kitchen in the particular quiet way he moved everywhere and stood beside her. He said, in a voice so soft she had to lean slightly toward him. She kept the good lamp near the window. For reading. Pa liked to read in the evenings. It was the most he had said since she arrived. Clara received it the way you received something fragile, which was carefully and without making too much of it. Near the window, she repeated. That is good to know. Thank you, Owen. He looked at her for another moment. Then he went to the broom closet and took out the broom without being asked and began sweeping the front room floor in long, methodical strokes. Lily appeared at Clara's elbow. Owen sweeping means he likes you, she said with the authority of a 5-year-old who has access to information that older people overlook. He only sweeps for people he likes. Clara looked at the small boy moving carefully through the front room, pushing the Wyoming dust before him in tidy arcs. That is good to know as well, she said. She went to help him. 3 days into her time at the ranch, Mrs. Harriet Weston came to call. She arrived in a good buggy with her niece Ruth beside her and a covered basket of baked goods on the seat between them, and the visit was framed as a neighborly welcome in the way that reconnaissance missions are sometimes framed as social calls. Clara recognized it for what it was within the first 4 minutes of conversation. Harriet Weston was a large woman in the way that some women were large, not in physical dimension, but in the amount of space she occupied in any room. She entered a kind of gravitational presence that organized other people's positioning relative to her without any apparent effort. She was direct without being impolite. She asked questions that sounded like pleasantries. She assessed Clara the way a livestock buyer assessed an animal efficiently and without sentiment, taking inventory of everything observable and drawing conclusions from the complete picture. She praised the children with the particular warmth that served simultaneously as an implication that they had been better managed before Clara arrived. She mentioned Ruth's capabilities twice in the span of 15 minutes in the context of neighborliness rather than candidacy, but with the precision of a woman who knew that context was everything. She said as she was leaving that the community was very fond of the Calhoun children and took a great interest in their welfare. She said this in the tone of someone making a statement that doubled as a warning, and Clara received it as exactly that. After the buggy disappeared down the ranch road, Clara stood on the porch for a moment. The Wyoming afternoon lay around her in its enormous indifference, the sage flats and the distant blue rise of the mountains, and the sky that had no apparent interest in the dramas of people below it. She had met Harriet Weston before. Not this specific woman, but this specific certainty, this conviction that the world could be organized into categories of sufficient and insufficient, and that the people in the insufficient category should have the good grace to acknowledge their placement and arrange themselves accordingly. She had met it in Hartford, and she had met it at the church, and she had met it in the expressions of the women at Robert's funeral who had known months before the midwife confirmed it what was wrong with Robert Hayes's wife. She was still standing there when she heard small feet on the porch boards behind her. She turned. Lily was standing in the doorway with her rag doll under one arm and her expression serious in the way that 5-year-olds' expressions were serious when they were about to say something that mattered. "Owen left something on your windowsill," Lily said. "He does that when he likes someone. Mama always said it meant he was paying attention." Clara went upstairs. On the windowsill of her bedroom, placed with the deliberateness of something carefully considered, was a smooth river stone of unusual shape, round and slightly flattened, a warm brown color with a faint stripe of white quartz running through it like a seam. She picked it up, turned it over in her palm. It fit perfectly in her hand, weighted and cool and complete. She set it beside her mother's Bible on the dresser. She stood there for a moment looking at it. Outside, the Wyoming afternoon was going toward evening, and downstairs she could hear the sounds of the children beginning the particular negotiation of the pre-supper hour. Cole's voice flat and declarative, Noah's voice at its usual carrying volume, Lily's feet on the stairs. She had been in this house for 3 days. She had 3 more people to reach, and one of them had just offered her a riverstone, and she understood that this was in its own specific language exactly what it was a beginning. She went downstairs to start the evening meal, and the Calhoun Ranch began slowly and without ceremony to learn what it felt like to have someone new inside its walls who intended to stay. 3 weeks into her time at the Calhoun Ranch, Clara had established something that was not yet peace, but which resembled at certain angles the possibility of it. The household ran with more regularity than it had in 18 months. Meals arrived at approximately the same hour each day. The kitchen was clean in a way that suggested sustained attention rather than occasional effort. The children knew because they had tested it in the specific and merciless way that children test things that she would be there in the morning and would still be there at night. This sounds like a small thing. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing that mattered most to children who had learned without warning that the most important person in the house could be there on Tuesday and gone before Saturday. Lily had become Clara's shadow in the kitchen, materializing at her elbow with the reliability of a particular sound following a particular action, and she narrated Margaret's methods with the intensity of a child who understood that memory required active maintenance. She told Clara which spoon was Margaret's preferred instrument for stirring gravy. She identified the dish that came out only for Sunday roasts. She explained the logic behind the arrangement of dried herbs in the pantry window which was Margaret's logic and therefore correct by definition. Clara listened to all of it with the kind of attention that made Lily feel heard rather than humored, which is a different thing entirely, and children always know the difference. Noah had appointed himself as her social ambassador to the known world. He introduced her to every ranch hand, every neighboring child who came within range, and every stray dog that wandered through the yard, with the comprehensive enthusiasm of someone who believed that the most interesting thing in any situation was the people in it and who wanted to ensure that everyone was properly acquainted with everyone else. Owen had graduated from Riverstones to occasional presence. He appeared at her elbow when she was working alone, not speaking, but close, occupying the same room with the quality of a deliberate choice. He was there when she swept the front room there, when she was in the garden attempting to coax something living from soil that had been unattended too long, there when she sat on the porch in the 10 minutes before supper that she had claimed as the day's only reliably quiet interval. She had learned to receive his presence without commenting on it, without turning to look at him too directly, which she understood somehow would cause him to withdraw. He was like a bird that would sit on your hand if you held it perfectly still, but would disappear the instant your fingers moved. Ethan had moved from watchful hostility to watchful cooperation. He asked her things now, practical questions framed as functional inquiries rather than conversation, whether she thought the stitching on Noah's school shirt was worth repairing, or whether the shirt itself had reached the end of its useful life, whether she knew anything about treating rope burns because one of the younger ranch hands had caught his palm badly on a cattle line and Will was in the far pasture. The questions were the questions of someone beginning to see a resource rather than an intrusion, and Clara answered each one with the same direct practicality with which they were asked, and neither of them made anything more of it than it was. Cole remained the wall she had not found a door in. 9-year-old arms perpetually crossed, jaw, perpetually set the flatness in his eyes when he looked at her, a kind of deliberate opacity, a refusal to allow any legible expression that might be interpreted as openness. She did not push. She understood that Cole's anger was not about her. She understood it in the specific way you understood something that you had seen the inside of yourself from a different angle but recognizable nonetheless. His grief had taken the shape of anger because anger was a shape that felt like agency, and taking away a child's anger before he had somewhere else to put the grief was the cruelest thing a person could do. She gave him space and she gave him time, and she kept showing up, and she let the wall stand until it decided what it wanted to do. She had found Margaret's recipe box on the top shelf of the pantry exactly where Will had mentioned it one evening on the back porch when she had asked about the family's preferred dishes. A small wooden box with the initials MC carved into the lid, the carving careful and deeply done, the work of someone who wanted it to last. Opening it felt like reading someone's private correspondence. The cards inside were written in Margaret's hand, a clear and slanted script spotted with years of kitchen accidents, small stains that were their own kind of record. Each card was a piece of a life, a version of a person preserved in the specific medium of what she had fed her family and how she had fed them, and what notes she had left herself in the margins about what to do differently next time. She used the recipes carefully and with something that she could only call reverence, because that was what the situation required. It started on a Tuesday morning with Lily waking fussy. The little girl appeared in the kitchen doorway at an hour earlier than usual, her dark hair tangled and her eyes heavy with a sleep that had not refreshed her. She was clingy in a way that was not entirely unusual for Lily, who expressed most of her emotions through physical proximity, but there was a quality to the cleaninginess this morning that Clara registered before she could have explained why. Something slightly off in the child's color. Something too warm in the hand that reached for Clara's arm. By mid-morning, when Clara put her palm flat to Lily's forehead, the warmth had become something else entirely. She kept her face composed. She had learned in the weeks at the ranch that these children read adult faces with a precision born of having watched one adult face for years before it disappeared, and that the information they gathered from Clara's expressions was information that shaped what they allowed themselves to feel. She kept her voice level. She tucked the blankets around Lily in the small bed in the room the twins shared, told her she would bring cold water and honey tea, and went downstairs to find Ethan. She told him to ride for his father. She used exactly the words she needed to use, and no more than that, but she used them in the order. and with the tone that communicated what a longer speech would have communicated, and Ethan was saddled and moving before she finished speaking. She told Cole he needed to ride to town for Dr. Price. Cole looked at her for 3 full seconds. She could see him considering the refusal, which was his standard operating position, regarding her instructions, and she watched him read something in her face that got past the standard operating position entirely. He ran for the barn without a word. This moment mattered. She did not have time to note it properly, but she filed it in the place where she kept the things that were going to be important later. By noon, the fever had climbed to a height that changed the calculation. Lily was drifting conscious and then not reaching in her confusion for something that was not in the room. She called for Margaret. Not for Clara, not for Will, but for Margaret, with the specific and heartbroken certainty of a sick child reaching toward the thing she believed could fix everything. Clara answered every time. She said quietly and steadily, "Your mama loves you, sweetheart. I am here. I am right here." She did not tell the child that what she wanted was not available. She simply occupied the space beside the wanting, which was all she could do and which was not nothing. Dr. Price arrived with Cole less than an hour after the boy had ridden. He was a grizzled man in his middle 60s who had been practicing medicine in Wyoming long enough to have developed the professional composure that came from having seen everything, and Clara watched his face during the examination with the attention of someone who understood that his face would tell her what his words would take longer to deliver. His face told her it was serious before he straightened and turned to face the room. Scarlet fever. The words settled in the air with the specific weight of a diagnosis that everyone present had been afraid was coming. Dr. Price explained the course of action without softening the stakes. The fever was the primary enemy. Keep the other children clear of the room. Cool compresses applied consistently. Willow bark extract in water every 3 hours. Fluids constantly by any method that worked. Monitor the temperature. If it climbed past a point, he specified there were decisions they would need to make that he would rather not discuss in front of the patient. He looked at Clara. She needs someone who can stay awake all night and hold the line without panicking. Can you do that? Yes, Clara said. The word came out of her in the same way the word yes had come out of her on the train platform 3 weeks ago, which was to say, without hesitation and from somewhere below the level of conscious decision, from the part of a person that knows what it is going to do before the thinking part catches up. Will arrived 15 minutes after the doctor. He had ridden hard from the north pasture, and it showed in him in the set of his jaw and the color in his face and the controlled speed with which he took the stairs 2 at a time. Doctor. Price met him in the hallway and spoke to him in low tones, and Clara heard the specific silence that followed certain kinds of medical information. The silence of a man absorbing something that costs him something significant to absorb. When Will came into the room, his face had the quality of a man who has made himself calm by main force, and who is maintaining the calm because the alternative would not help the child in the bed. He looked at Lily, then he looked at Clara. "Dr. Price says you are the right person for this," he said. "The boys will be fine through the night," Clara said. "Ethan knows the morning routine. Cole can manage the chickens and the stove for 1 day. You focus on the ranch tomorrow morning. I will focus on Lily." Will looked at his daughter for a long moment. Something moved through his face that he did not fully succeed in keeping to himself. Then he nodded once and left the room to speak to his sons. Clara pulled the chair to the bedside, arranged the basin and the compresses, and the small brown bottle of willow bark extract, and settled in for what came next. The first hours were manageable in the way that the beginning of hard things was sometimes manageable before the full weight of them arrived. Lily moved in and out of restless sleep. The fever held at its initial elevation, unpleasant, but not yet at the threshold Dr. Price had specified. Clara worked the rhythm of cool cloths and measured drops of extract in whispered conversation addressed to a child who was sometimes present enough to hear it and sometimes not present at all. The boys cycled through the hallway outside the room. Ethan appeared at 10 at midnight, at 2 in the morning, each time needing the specific reassurance of watching Lily's chest move before he could return to his own bed, and Clara gave him that reassurance each time without comment, understanding that he needed to witness it, and that witnessing it was a form of keeping watch that she would not deprive him of. Noah had fallen asleep on the floor of the hallway sometime around 9, and was there curled against the wall when Clara checked at 11. Owen had positioned himself at the top of the stairs and remained there, a small sentinel, at the edge of the darkness, keeping his own form of vigil. Cole did not come upstairs. Clara noted his absence and filed it the way she filed everything about Cole, carefully and without judgment, understanding that his absence was its own kind of presence. At 3 in the morning, the fever spiked. She knew it before she checked. She knew it in the way Lily's body changed in the bed, the restlessness becoming something more urgent and less directed, the small hands reaching and clenching at the sheets, the breathing shifting from ragged to labored in a way that was quantitatively different from what it had been an hour before. She pressed her palm to the child's forehead and felt a heat that belonged in a furnace, not in a 5-year-old girl's body, and something in Clara's chest went very cold and very focused at the same time. She did not panic. She understood in that moment of cold focus that panic was the one thing she could not afford. That panic was a luxury with a price tag attached to it that she would not allow the situation to charge her. She moved instead with the efficiency of someone who has stopped deciding and started doing, who has found the ground beneath the fear and is operating from it. She stripped the heavy blankets away. She got the water from the cold cellar, the coldest water available, and she applied it everywhere she could reach, forehead and neck, and wrists, and behind the knees. She administered the extract at the full authorized dosage. She kept talking because silence in this room at this hour would be a form of concession, and she was not prepared to concede anything. She talked about Hartford winters, about the particular quality of December mornings when the Connecticut River froze at the edges and the whole world went white and quiet. She talked about a cat named Admiral who had been her companion through most of her childhood and who had held the firm opinion that any book she tried to read was better suited as a sleeping surface than a reading material. She talked about the train journey west, the first sunrise over the plains, seen through a dirty window, the way the sky went from black to purple to a specific shade of rose that she had not seen before and had not been able to name. She talked to Lily, and she talked to Margaret, and she talked to whatever was present in the room that had the authority to make decisions she could not make herself. "You cannot have her," she said at some point in the deepest part of the night, when the fever was at its highest and the room felt like a place where the ordinary rules were temporarily suspended. She said it to nothing in particular, to the fever, to whatever force presided over these calculations. "This family has already given you enough. You cannot have her." It was not rational. She knew it was not rational. She said it anyway because it was the most honest thing available to her in that moment, and honesty was the only currency she had ever found reliable. The fever broke just before dawn. It did not break dramatically. It released the way a fist unclenches slowly, and then, with a completeness that felt like something physical leaving the room. Lily's skin, which had been burning to the touch for hours, became merely warm. Her breathing smoothed from its labored effort into something that resembled the ordinary breathing of sleep. Her hands, which had been gripping and releasing the sheets throughout the worst of it, opened flat and still. Clara pressed her palm to the child's forehead and felt the difference. She started crying before she fully registered that she was doing it. Tears moved down her face with the unhurried completion of something that had been waiting for permission, and she let them go because there was no one to see them, and because she had earned them, and because she was too tired to stop them, even if she had wanted to. Will found her there when the first gray light came through the window. He had been in the hallway all night. She understood close enough to hear and far enough to understand that what was happening in this room required exactly one person, and that person was doing it. He stood in the doorway and took in the scene with eyes that had not slept. "Fever broke about an hour ago," Clara said. Her voice came out rough and used, scraped down to its essential components by the night. She woke up briefly, asked for water, managed a few sips. Something moved through Will Calhoun's face that he could not entirely manage. He was good at managing. He had been practicing for 18 months, and he was genuinely good at it. But the specific sight of this woman who had arrived on his porch 3 weeks ago as a stranger, sitting beside his daughter in the gray dawn after fighting for her life all night, got past the management and showed in his face clearly enough that Clara saw it. He swallowed it back, but she saw it. "You stayed all night," he said. "I told you I would." "I know." He crossed to the other side of the bed and looked down at Lily, who was sleeping now with the deep, untroubled sleep of a body that has finished fighting and is in recovery. "I know you did." Dr. Price arrived at first light as he had promised, and his examination was efficient, and his conclusion was the most welcome sentence anyone had spoken in the past 12 hours: she would live. The fever's breaking was the decisive hurdle. Rest fluids, light food confinement, to bed for a week, regardless of how much better she felt. Barring complications, a full recovery. He looked at Clara and said in the straightforward way he said everything, "This child is alive because someone stayed awake all night and held the line. That is the whole of it, Mr. Calhoun. That is the complete story." Will looked at Clara across the bed. He did not speak immediately. Will Calhoun did not use words when another form of communication was available, and what his face communicated in that moment was something that Clara received and did not ask him to translate, because translation would have cost it something. It was better to leave whole. The boys had gathered in the hallway outside the room when Dr. Price finished assembled without coordination, in the way that families assembled around things that mattered. Ethan was there. Noah had woken from the hallway floor and was standing beside his brother, with his eyes still carrying the faint glaze of interrupted sleep. Owen was at the top of the stairs where he had been all night, and Cole. Cole was at the far end of the hallway. He was standing against the wall with his arms at his sides, which was notable because Cole Calhoun's arms were virtually never at his sides. They were always crossed, always the physical expression of a defense he was maintaining. His eyes were red. He had been crying or had come very close to it for hours, and the evidence of it was still present in his face despite his evident efforts to remove it. When Clara came out of the room, he met her eyes. It was the first time he had allowed direct eye contact without immediately looking away, without the flat opacity that was his standard defense against legible expression. He looked at her, and she looked back, and she saw for the first time what was underneath the wall. She saw a 9-year-old boy who had decided that loving things was the same as being made vulnerable to losing them, and who had spent 18 months maintaining his distance from everything that could hurt him, only to find himself standing in a hallway at dawn with the specific knowledge that his little sister had almost died, and that the woman he had refused to accept had stayed up all night to prevent it. Clara did not say anything. She opened her arms. Cole looked at her for a moment that contained everything he had been carrying. Then he crossed the hallway in 3 steps and put his face against her shoulder and shook with the force of 18 months of accumulated grief and 3 weeks of sustained resistance and 1 night of pure terror, and Clara held him and did not say a word about any of it. She held him until he was finished. She did not mention it to Will, not that day or any day after. She did not describe it to the other children. It belonged to Cole, and she kept it for him, and that keeping was its own kind of promise. Noah said, "You saved her. You saved Lily." "We all did," Clara said, which was the correct answer and the true one because Ethan had ridden for his father without hesitation, and Cole had ridden for the doctor without argument, and Owen had kept watch at the top of the stairs all night, and Noah had been there, and all of it mattered. Owen said in his careful, quiet voice, stepping forward from the top of the stairs, "You stayed. That is what Mama always did. She stayed." Clara looked at this small boy who had barely spoken in 18 months and who had just offered her the most significant comparison available in his vocabulary. "Your mother sounds like someone worth being compared to," Clara said. Owen considered this with his usual gravity. Then he nodded once, and that nod was everything. That evening, as Clara was finishing the supper dishes, Owen appeared at her elbow in the way he always appeared, without sound and with purpose. He was holding something in both hands. It was a tin cup, plain and dented, with a small flower scratched into the metal near the rim, the work of a nail and considerable patience. He held it out to her without speaking. Clara took it carefully, turning it in her hands. The scratched flower was rough but deliberate, the kind of mark made by someone who wanted it to last. She looked at Owen. He said in his quiet voice, "Pa made that for Mama. She used it every morning. He said she called it her lucky cup." He paused, choosing his next words with the care he brought to all of them. "I think you should have it now, because you stayed." He was gone before she could answer, disappearing up the stairs in his characteristic silence, leaving Clara standing at the kitchen basin with the dented cup in her hands and the scratched flower under her thumb, and the particular stillness of someone who has been given something they did not know they needed. She set the cup on the kitchen windowsill beside her mother's Bible. She stood there for a long moment looking at it, this small tin thing that carried 2 people's histories, the man who scratched a flower into it with a nail because he could not afford anything better, and the woman who called it her lucky cup for 12 years, and the small boy who understood without anyone telling him that it belonged with someone who had fought all night for the people he loved. The tears came quietly and she let them. The week of Lily's recovery restructured the household in ways that were not dramatic and were therefore permanent. Cole asked on the third day if he could carry Lily's supper tray upstairs. He phrased it as a logistical question, whether it would be more practical for him to bring it since he was already going upstairs anyway, which was transparently untrue since he had been on his way to no particular place, but Clara accepted the phrasing without comment and handed him the tray, and the transaction was complete. Ethan began asking her questions in a different register than before. He asked one evening while they were finishing the supper dishes, side by side, whether she thought Owen was going to be all right. Clara set down the dish she was drying. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think Owen is going to be more than all right," she said. "I think he is the kind of person who processes things deeply and slowly and completely, and that when he comes back out the other side, he is going to know exactly who he is. That takes longer than the quick version, but it tends to hold." Ethan was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "He talked more this week," he said, "since Lily got sick." "I know," Claire said. "Is that because of you?" "It is because of him," Claire said. "He decided something was worth saying. I happened to be there to hear it." Ethan nodded. He picked up the next dish. The conversation was over, but something in the quality of the silence that replaced it was different from the silences that had preceded it over the past 3 weeks. Owen began speaking in fuller sentences, still quietly still, with the careful word selection of someone who understood that language was not free, but with more frequency. He told her the names of the mountains visible from the north pasture on clear days. He told her that his mother used to walk the southern fence line in the evening, sometimes just to walk, not for any ranch purpose, just because the light was good in that direction at that hour. He left stones on her windowsill every few days, each one chosen with a deliberateness that suggested considerable thought about which stone was right for which day. Lily recovered with the focused intensity of a 5-year-old who has been denied activity for too long. On the 5th day, propped up in bed with her rag doll and her stubborn refusal to stay rested, she said, "When I was really sick, you said you were not going to let them have me." Clara looked up. "You heard that," she said. "I heard some things," Lily said. "I was not always asleep. Sometimes I was just too tired to open my eyes." She looked at Clara with the directness that had probably come from her father and the precision that had probably come from her mother. "Did you mean it?" "Yes," Clara said. "I meant it." Lily nodded as though this confirmed something she had already decided but wanted verified. "Good," she said, "because I am not ready to go yet. There are still a lot of things I want to do." 6 weeks after Clara's arrival, Will needed supplies from Millstone Creek. He had fence work that could not wait, so Clara took the wagon with Ethan, Cole, and Noah. Lily was still resting, and Owen had offered to stay with his sister with the seriousness of a child accepting a commission of genuine importance. The road to Millstone Creek took Clara through 8 miles of Wyoming morning, and the closer she got to town, the more she was aware of the weight of her first arrival, the platform the crowd, Will's voice carrying across the station. She had not been back in 6 weeks. She had kept the distance deliberately. Henderson's General Store was the first stop. Miss Henderson looked up when the bell chimed, and her eyes moved from Clara to the boys and back with the expression of someone who had been given advance information about this moment and was now navigating the gap between the information and the actual event. "Miss Hayes," Ethan said, with a clarity that was its own kind of statement, handing over the supply list. "Our mother needs flour, sugar, salt, and the other things on this list." The words landed quietly. Mrs. Henderson took the list without correcting the title, without the particular expression that Clara had learned to brace for, and went to fill the order. Harriet Weston arrived 8 minutes later. She came through the door with the timing of a woman who had been watching the road. The first minutes had the structure of a social call. Then the warmth receded. Harriet said that the community remained very concerned about the arrangement at the Calhoun Ranch. She said that a woman with Clara's particular history had no business being the primary influence in the development of 5 children who had already suffered considerable disruption. And then she said something about the territorial family court, about official investigations about the welfare of 5 children being raised by a woman with no legal standing. This was not a suggestion. Clara understood what it was. She kept her face composed. She drew on the specific reserves that come from having been told you are insufficient for long enough that you have made peace with the telling and are no longer frightened of the people who do it. Mrs. Weston, she said, her voice steady and clear in a room that had gone very quiet. I understand that you had a plan for this family. I understand that my arrival interrupted that plan, but I have been in that house for 6 weeks. I have learned where Margaret Calhoun kept her recipe box and why the curtains in the front room hang the way they do, and what Owen needs to feel safe enough to speak, and what makes Lily laugh when she has been crying. I stayed awake all night during a scarlet fever crisis, and I did not leave, and I will not leave, and whatever you choose to bring to the attention of the family court is something I will face when it arrives. She stopped. Then she added, because it needed to be said, you are measuring me against a standard that has nothing to do with those children. The standard you are using is about what a woman's body can produce, and I understand why you consider it relevant, and I am telling you directly that you are wrong. The silence in Henderson's general store was absolute. And then Cole Calhoun stepped forward from Clara's left side. 9 years old, his jaw set in exactly the way his father's jaw set when something needed to be said plainly. Mrs. Weston, he said in the flat and caring voice of a child who has decided to spend some of the anger he has been carrying for 18 months in a direction that actually deserves it. Miss Clara stayed awake all night when Lily was sick and did not leave. She was there the whole time. You were not there. Nobody from this town came. She fought for my sister all night by herself, and she did not leave even when it got the worst. So before you say one more word about whether she belongs with us, you should think about who was there and who was not. Ethan stepped forward on Clara's right side. Noah from behind her said, she is our mother. The 3 words fell into the room with the simplicity and weight of true things. Harriet Weston left the store without another word. Mrs. Henderson said quietly and without drama that the total came to $3.47, and that she wanted Clara to know that what she had said was correct, and that she was sorry she had not said as much herself sooner. Clara paid for the supplies. Outside, Cole loaded the flour into the wagon bed without being asked. When he finished, he looked at a point slightly to the left of Clara's face and said, she was wrong about you. Thank you, Cole, Clara said. I am not doing it for you, he said. He paused. I am doing it because Lily is alive. But the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost something. Clara kept her face steady and received it for what it was, which was everything. On the return journey, the postmaster flagged down the wagon with a letter forwarded through Agnes Burke's Denver office. Clara's name on the envelope in handwriting, she knew before she had fully processed what she was seeing. Her mother. The substance was this: her father's health had worsened. The door to Hartford was not entirely closed. But the final paragraph arrived with the particular weight of things meant to be kind that landed like something else entirely. Her mother had written, whatever arrangement you have made for yourself in the West, I hope it provides the security you need. I understand that for a woman in your circumstances, practical considerations must come before sentiment. Practical considerations before sentiment. Clara folded the letter precisely. She tucked it into her coat pocket. She was not going back to Hartford. She had known this before she read the letter. She knew it more completely now, which was a different kind of knowing, the kind that had been tested and had not changed. That evening, Will found her on the back porch. He brought the coffee. He sat in the other chair and waited, which was characteristic of him. She told him about the letter. She told him that there was family somewhere who did not know what to do with her, and that she was not going back, and that she wanted him to know the letter existed because she did not want secrets between them. Will was quiet for a while. I want to tell you something, he said. I should have said it sooner. The way you have handled this house and this family, what you did for Lily, the way you showed up today in that store, that is not practical consideration. That is character. And the people who cannot see that are not paying attention. She was past the age of crying easily, which meant the thing that moved through her chest at those words did so quietly and completely and without outward expression. My brother wants to visit, she said. Daniel, he is 17. He feels responsible for the circumstances that led me to the agency. Bring him, Will said without pause. This is your home, Clara. Anyone who belongs to you is welcome here. The words settled in the evening air between them. Home. Neither of them moved. It stayed where it was. Will said after a moment in a different quality of voice, there is something I have been trying to figure out how to say. For about 3 weeks. I have started several times and talked myself out of it because I did not want it to seem like the back door opened. Owen stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, his eyes serious. Pa, he said, Lily is asking for a story, and Ethan said to ask you, but you were outside and Miss Clara tells better stories anyway. Can she come? Something passed across Will's face that might have been frustration and was also something else entirely, something warmer and more private that he folded away before it became fully legible. Go ahead, he said. Clara stood setting her cup on the porch rail. She looked at Will, and he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. And in that moment, everything that had not been said remained present in the air between them, patient and specific and not going anywhere. Tomorrow, she said quietly. Tomorrow, he agreed. The right moment did not arrive the next day. It did not arrive because 2 days after the trip to Millstone Creek, a rider came out from town with a letter addressed to William Calhoun, rancher, bearing the seal of the Territorial Family Court of Wyoming. Will read it at the kitchen table. Then he came to find Clara in the garden and said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know before I do that nothing about this changes anything for me. He told her about the letter, the formal complaint, the 2 officials coming to inspect the home and interview the children, the signature on the complaint which he did not need to show her and which she understood before he said it. What happens if they decide I am not suitable, she asked. I will not let that happen, Will said. That is not an answer to the question I asked. No, he said, it is not. In the kitchen, through the open window, they could hear Lily's voice clear and certain, telling Noah something about the proper care of ragdolls. Clara looked at Will. Will looked at Clara. Between them, 6 weeks of a life built from ordinary days and small mercies, and one long, terrible night, and a river stone on a windowsill, and a dented cup with a scratched flower, and a letter read 47 times on a train through a state she had never seen before. I am not leaving, Clara said. I know, Will said. I am telling you so you know I mean it when the officials come, not because the situation requires me to stay, because I choose to. Something in Will's face shifted in the way she had seen it shift only a few times, the management dropping away briefly to show what was underneath. We will face it together, he said, and that was enough for now to keep going. The officials arrived on a Wednesday morning when the October light was coming in low, in particular across the basin, the kind of light that made the Wyoming landscape look like something a painter had arranged, rather than something that had simply grown this way over centuries. 2 men in suits that cost more than any ranch hand in the territory earned in a month, arriving in a hired buggy from the Millstone Creek Hotel, where they had spent the previous night under circumstances that their expressions suggested they had not found entirely comfortable. Mr. Arthur Langford and Mr. George Simmons represented the Territorial Family Court of Wyoming. Behind their buggy came the county lawyer Samuel Hutchins, who had the expression of a man who understood exactly what this visit was and who had not been able to find a professional reason to decline participation in it. Clara met them on the porch. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, not from anxiety in the way that anxiety announces itself, but from the particular wakefulness of someone who has made a decision and is simply waiting for the moment to act on it. She had dressed carefully not to perform anything, but because she understood that first impressions were a form of communication that preceded language, and she wanted the first communication to be competence and steadiness rather than apology. She had made breakfast for the children at the ordinary hour, sent them through their morning chores at the ordinary pace, and told each of them individually and without drama that some men were coming to ask questions about how things were at the ranch and that they should answer honestly and completely. Cole had said, "What if their questions are stupid?" Clara had said, "Answer them honestly and completely anyway." Cole had considered this. Then he had nodded, which from Cole was a form of oath. Will stood beside her on the porch when the buggy came up the drive. He had the quality of stillness that she had come to associate with him at his most alert, the stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite, a man who had gathered himself completely and was fully present and waiting. He had shaved that morning, which he did not always do on weekdays, and she understood that this was its own form of preparation. Mr. Langford descended from the buggy first. He introduced himself, introduced Mr. Simmons, introduced Samuel Hutchins, and explained the purpose of the visit in language that was formal and not unkind. They had received a formal complaint regarding the welfare of 5 children. The complaint raised questions about the legal standing and suitability of the current caregiver. The court was obligated to investigate. They would need to inspect the premises, review the household's condition, and speak with each child individually. This was standard procedure and did not constitute a prejudgment of any kind. Will said they were welcome to inspect whatever they needed to inspect. He said this in the voice that Clara had learned to read, as the voice beneath which a considerable amount of cold and precise anger was being maintained at a temperature that would not interfere with the work at hand. The inspection moved through the house with the systematic thoroughness of a process designed to leave nothing unexamined. The kitchen was clean in a way that suggested daily maintenance rather than emergency preparation. The pantry was stocked with the forward-looking inventory of someone who understood Wyoming winters. The children's sleeping areas were orderly and showed evidence of regular care. Mended clothing hung properly, books stacked with the apparent assumption that they would be used again. The front room had the particular quality of a space that was lived in rather than simply occupied. The good lamp positioned near the window where someone sat with it in the evenings, the curtains freshly hemmed, the floor swept to the corners. Langford noted things in a small leather book. Simmons examined the cold cellar. Samuel Hutchins stood near the doorway at each location with the expression of a man cataloging something he would rather not be cataloging. Dr. Price had sent a written statement which Will had obtained through a ride to town the previous day. The statement was written in the doctor's characteristic directness and contained, among other clinical observations, the professional opinion that the nursing care administered during the recent scarlet fever crisis had been the primary factor in the patient's survival, and that the quality of that care was not something he had observed frequently in his 30 years of practice in the territory. Langford read the statement twice. He folded it and placed it in the leather book. The child interviews were conducted individually in the sitting room, while Clara waited in the kitchen with Will and a pot of coffee that neither of them drank. The sitting room door was closed. The house was quiet in the specific way that houses became quiet around things that mattered, as though the walls were holding their breath. Ethan's account was delivered with the precision of a 12-year-old who had decided that this was a situation requiring accuracy above all else. He described the household before and after Clara's arrival with the effect of a comparative analysis so clear that even officials with no particular investment in the outcome could follow it. He described the burned cornbread and the sludge coffee and the accumulated disorder of 18 months, and then he described what existed now. And he said, without being prompted, that he believed his mother would have wanted someone like Miss Hayes here, and that he considered this the most relevant information he had to offer. Noah's interview was conducted at a pace that Langford apparently found challenging to manage. The substance of his contribution, distilled from its considerable volume, was that Miss Clara was the best at eggs and at stories and at finding things that were lost and at knowing what you needed before you said it, and that the ranch was better now than it had been, and that Lily was alive, which was the most important thing. Owen's contribution was 3 sentences delivered in his careful, quiet voice. He said she stays when she is needed. She listens when someone talks. She does not make Lily feel wrong for missing Mama. The officials moved on more quickly than they had planned, which may have been because they understood there was nothing to add to those sentences and nothing to ask that would improve on them. Lily, 5 years old and fully recovered and possessed of the absolute confidence of a child who has been genuinely loved, told the officials, when asked whether she was well cared for, that she would like them to look at the hem of her dress, which Miss Clara had mended last week, using the same stitch that her mother had used, and that she thought this was because they were both the kind of people who paid attention, and that paying attention was the most important thing a person could do for another person, which was something her mother had told her, and which she believed completely. Langford wrote this down. His expression, Clara would later understand from the account Will received secondhand, was that of a man encountering something that his official forms did not have a category for. Cole went in last. Clara was aware of him going in. She was aware of the weight of what the officials had been told about him, that he was the child most likely to evidence instability or discontent. Harriet Weston, in filing her complaint, had clearly done her research. The sitting room door was closed for 11 minutes. When it opened, Cole came out first. He walked past Clara to the kitchen without stopping, went to the water pump, got himself a glass of water, drank it, and stood at the window looking out at the yard. His arms were at his sides. The substance of Cole Calhoun's testimony, which Clara learned much later from Will, who learned it from Samuel Hutchins, who had been present, was this. Cole had told the officials that he had not wanted Clara there. He had said this directly and without apology because he believed in being direct and he did not apologize for his own history. He had said he had not been kind about it and she had not left. He had said she had stayed and kept trying through 3 weeks of him being difficult, and that she had then stayed awake all night during a fever crisis that he had spent hiding in his room being terrified, and that afterward he had understood something he had not understood before, which was that the kind of person who stayed when staying was hard was a specific and uncommon kind of person. He had said his mother had been that kind of person. He had said Miss Clara was that kind of person. He had said that was what mattered in his family, and that was all he had to say. He was 9 years old. The four of them gathered in the front room with Samuel Hutchins standing near the window and the Wyoming afternoon light coming in at its October angle across the clean floor. Langford delivered the court's assessment. The home was well maintained. The children were healthy, properly clothed, and nourished, clearly engaged in their education, and showed no evidence of neglect or harm. The caregiver's conduct during the recent medical emergency had been noted in Dr. Price's statement and was consistent with the children's own accounts. The testimony of 5 children interviewed separately without coordination had been, in Langford's careful phrasing, remarkably consistent in its essential conclusions. There was a pause. However, Langford continued the legal irregularity remained unresolved. Clara Hayes had no formal standing as these children's guardian. No adoption paperwork, no documented legal relationship that would protect her position or the children's security in the event of anything happening to Will Calhoun. A blood relative petitioning the court could, under those circumstances, remove her from the household and pursue custody of the children. What would it take to resolve it? Will asked. Simmons said marriage would do it. If Miss Hayes were your legal wife, her standing as the children's mother would be unassailable under territorial law. No one could challenge it. The room was quiet. Will did not look at Clara immediately. He looked at the window at the October light, threw it at the mountains visible in the distance beyond the yard. He was doing something in his own thinking that required a moment, and Clara gave him the moment. Then he turned to her. Clara, he said, I need to talk to you, outside. Just the two of us. Langford said they would wait. They stood on the back porch. The garden was behind them, still producing, in defiance of the October cold, the one section that had thrived through the drought, still showing the last tomatoes red and improbable against the dark green of the vines. The sky was the particular shade of Wyoming blue that existed at altitude and could not quite be reproduced in the imagination of someone who had not seen it in person. Will turned to face her. I need to say this before you say anything, he started, because I need you to understand something specific. Clara waited. I have been trying to figure out how to say this to you for 3 weeks, he said. I have started probably a dozen times and talked myself out of it every time because I did not want it to seem like something it is not. I did not want you to think it was about the children, or about legal protection, or about anything practical. He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, which was the only tell he had, the only place where what he was feeling showed up physically before it arrived in his face. The morning after Lily's fever broke, he said, I stood in the hallway outside her room for a long time before I came in. I have thought about why I stood there that long, and what I understand is that I was not ready for what I was going to find when I came through that door, and I was not ready because I already knew it was going to be something I did not know how to hold. He looked at her directly. I loved my wife, he said. Margaret was the first great thing in my life. She was the person I built everything beside, and I will love her until I am in the ground. I am not going to suggest otherwise, and I am not going to pretend that what I feel now is the same as what I felt then, because it is not the same. It is different. Different how? Claire asked, because she needed to hear him say it. Steadier, he said. It feels like choosing rather than falling. At 25, when I married Margaret, I fell, and I did not understand the difference between falling and choosing. What I feel now is the difference. Every morning for 6 weeks, I have chosen to value you being in this house. I have chosen to look forward to the evenings when we sit on this porch. I have chosen to notice you, Clara, every day. That is not falling, but I do not think it is less. The October air was very still around them. The officials want me to marry you for legal reasons, Will said, and I can frame it that way if you need me to. But I was going to ask you anyway. Before they came, I had it planned, not on a porch with government officials in the sitting room, and I grant you that, but the question was going to be the same question. He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out a small ring, a simple band of silver with a small garnet set in it, dark red and quiet, the color of something precious that did not need to announce itself. I bought this 3 weeks ago from the jeweler in Millstone Creek, he said, the day after you sat with me on this porch and told me you were not going back to Hartford. A man named Aldrich runs the jewelry counter. He can confirm the date. I want you to know that this is not a response to Harriet Weston or to Langford and Simmons or to any complaint filed with any court. This is me asking you. He held the ring in his open palm. Marry me, Clara, not because the law requires it, because I am asking you to. Because I want you as my partner in everything. Because I have chosen you every day for 6 weeks without saying so. And I want to say so, and I want the world to know it. Clara looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the letter from her mother, about practical considerations before sentiment, about the footnote in an agency file about a train platform in May, and a man who stood in front of an entire town and told them they were wrong. She thought about the recipe box on the top shelf of the pantry. She thought about a river stone placed on a windowsill by a small boy who had decided she was worth the gesture. She thought about a dented tin cup with a scratched floor placed in her hands at the kitchen basin. She thought about Cole's shoulder shaking against her in the hallway at dawn. She thought about Lily's hand holding hers through the fever with a grip that was stronger than it had any right to be. I'm going to say yes, she said, but you are going to know why. Not because of the officials, not because of legal standing, not because of anything that has happened this week. She paused. I am saying yes because somewhere in the last 6 weeks I stopped being a mail-order bride and became someone who belongs to this family. And I want to belong to it properly. In every sense, she met his eyes steadily. I love those children, and I choose you, Will. I have been choosing you for weeks. I did not know how to say it without it seeming like more than you were ready for. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were calloused and certain and not entirely steady, which was the detail she kept afterward, the detail that made the moment real in a way that perfectly steady hands would not have. He did not kiss her immediately because this was a man who did not do things dramatically when he could do them correctly. He held her hand between both of his and looked at her. And what she saw in his face with all the management down was a man who had been surviving for 18 months and had just stopped. I had a whole thing planned, he said. It was going to be better than this. It is perfect, Clara said. There was going to be a dinner, a proper one. Will. And I was going to find the right words. Will, you found them. The corner of his mouth lifted, and the smile that followed was the full version, the one she had seen only twice before in 6 weeks. And it did what it always did, which was to make him look like a different person and like the same person simultaneously, like the man he had been before grief moved in and stayed too long. He kissed her then there on the back porch with the Wyoming sky above them and the garden behind them and the officials waiting in the sitting room and 5 children somewhere inside the house. And it was not dramatic, and it was not theatrical, and it was the most honest thing Clara Hayes had experienced in years. She thought, going to be all right. Daniel Hayes arrived at noon. He came on horseback from Millstone Creek, where he had been staying at the hotel since Ethan's message reached him 2 days ago. He was 17 and carried the particular physical uncertainty of a young man who had grown faster than his sense of himself, had caught up with all height and awkward grace, and the anxious dignity of someone who understood he had failed a test he should have passed, and was here to say so in person. He dismounted at the gate, tied his horse, and walked up the drive with the deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing an arrival. Clara met him at the gate before he reached the porch, and they stood looking at each other in the way of 2 people from the same place who had traveled very different roads to arrive at the same moment. Daniel said, "Are you all right, really? Not the version you would put in a letter." "Really," Clara said, "better than I have been in years." He searched her face with the scrutiny of a brother who had known her since before she could speak, and who had learned specifically and painfully to distinguish between the versions of composure she performed and the versions that were genuine. "He is good to you." "He is the best man I have ever known," Clara said. "He defended me to this entire town the day I stepped off the train before he knew me at all, simply because he thought it was the right thing to do. He chose me exactly as I am, and his children. She stopped. She looked at her brother and chose to tell him the true thing rather than the manageable thing. Daniel, I could not have children, and I have 5. Not by blood, by choice. Theirs and mine both. That is better. That is so much better than I ever thought available to me. Daniel was not a young man who considered it a weakness to cry in front of his sister. He wiped his eyes without embarrassment and pulled her into a hug that had 6 months of guilty correspondence behind it. I should have stopped him, he said into her hair, when Pa arranged the agency's situation. I should have said something. You were 16, Clara said. You could not have stopped anything. And if it had been stopped, I would not be here. I would not have these children, or this house, or this man, or this life. So you see, the thing you feel guilty about is the thing I am most grateful for. He pulled back and looked at her. That is either very wise or very generous, he said. Perhaps both, Clara said. Come and meet everyone. There is a wedding happening this afternoon, and you are going to be one of the witnesses. Daniel stared at her. This afternoon, the officials are here from the family court. It turns out that being married resolves several things at once. Will ask me on the back porch. I said yes, the rest is logistics. Her brother looked at her for a long moment, reading everything she was and everything the last 6 months had made her, and what he read apparently satisfied him completely, because the last of the tension went out of his face and something that was the genuine version of relief took its place. All right, he said, let me meet your family. The ceremony was held at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in front of the house, which was where it needed to be, outside under the October sky, in the particular light that this place made at this hour, the light that the Wyoming basin kept for its best occasions. Lily had been awake since 9 in the morning, managing the preparations with the executive authority of a 5-year-old who understood that this was the most important day in recent memory. She had enlisted Noah as her deputy and Ethan as her logistical consultant, and the result was that the porch had been swept to a standard exceeding its ordinary maintenance, and there were asters and late-season goldenrod gathered from the edges of the property and arranged in a tin pail with more sincerity than elegance, which was exactly the right proportion. Owen held the ring. Will had given it to him with the specific gravity of a man who understood that entrusting Owen Calhoun with something important was a statement about what Owen was worth, and Owen had received it with both hands and the expression of someone who intended to discharge the responsibility completely. He stood during the ceremony with his hands clasped in front of him and the ring inside them perfectly still, his dark eyes serious and present in a way they had not been 6 months ago, in a way that suggested that whoever Owen Calhoun was going to become had decided to start becoming it. Mr. Langford performed the ceremony. He had the authority under territorial law, and whatever his expectations had been when he drove out from Millstone Creek that morning, what he found himself presiding over in the late afternoon light appeared to have adjusted them considerably. He spoke the words with a gentleness that was not part of his official function, but which seemed in this instance appropriate. Dr. Edmund Price was the second witness. He had driven out from town, not because anyone had summoned him, but because word traveled in Millstone Creek with its characteristic efficiency, and some things were worth making the drive for. He stood at the edge of the assembled family with the slight smile of a man watching something come right that he had reason to hope would come right. The children stood in a row with the collective gravity of people who understood they were participants in something historical. Lily had her asters. Noah had arranged himself beside his sister with his gap-toothed expression of complete enthusiasm. Ethan stood straight in his good shirt that he had pressed himself that morning, carrying the occasion with the dignity of a young man who understood its weight. Cole stood at the end of the row with his arms at his sides, which was where his arms were now, which was a kind of miracle that no one in the family was going to remark upon, because that was how it needed to be treated, as simply the way things were. When Langford reached the vows, Will said his in the voice he used for things he meant without qualification, steady and clear and carrying in the afternoon air. When Clara said hers, her voice held. Langford said, by the authority granted to me by the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Lily said at a volume not entirely suited to a solemn occasion, but perfectly suited to everything else about this afternoon. Now nobody can take Mama Clara away. Nobody corrected her. Will kissed Clara with the same economy and certainty that characterized everything he did, and when they broke apart, he rested his forehead briefly against hers and said, "Hello, Mrs. Calhoun." "Hello, Mr. Calhoun," she said. The children descended on them both with the organized chaos of people who have been maintaining their composure for as long as composure was socially required and who are now released from the obligation. Lily attached herself to Clara's left side. Noah attached himself to Will's right. Ethan shook his father's hand with a formality that lasted approximately 3 seconds before Will pulled him into a proper embrace. Owen pressed close to Clara's other side, not speaking present in the way he was always present, complete and sufficient. Cole stood slightly apart, which was still Cole's way, and would probably always be somewhat Cole's way because some aspects of a person's character were not changed by circumstance, but deepened by it. But when Clara looked at him over Lily's head, he met her eyes directly. He nodded once. She nodded back. It was everything. The officials filed their report the following week. The complaint filed against the Calhoun household was closed. The court's findings noted that the home was exceptionally maintained, the children thriving, and the family's legal standing fully regularized. The file on the Calhoun case was sealed and placed in the court's records, where it would remain for as long as the territorial court maintained its records, which was a very long time. Harriet Weston received a copy of this report. She received it in her parlor on a Tuesday morning, with her niece Ruth present, and she read it with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and she set it on the side table and looked at her hands for a moment. She was not a woman who apologized. She had not apologized for anything in 61 years, and she was not going to begin now. She was also not a woman who was impervious to evidence. She had organized her understanding of the world into categories, and those categories had served her reliably for a long time. What the Calhoun situation had demonstrated with the specificity of a thing documented in court records and confirmed by a doctor's professional statement and attested to by 5 children interviewed separately, was that one of her categories was insufficient. A woman who could not bear children had fought through a scarlet fever night for another woman's daughter and brought the child home from the edge of it. Harriet Weston picked up the report. She set it in the drawer of the side table. She told Ruth that the county commissioner's nephew from Cheyenne was apparently a very decent young man, and that perhaps she should give him more serious consideration. The letters to influential women stopped being written. Ruth Weston married the county commissioner's nephew the following spring and moved to Cheyenne, and by all accounts was reasonably content, which was the best available outcome for a story that could have gone several worse ways. Clara did not forgive Harriet Weston because forgiveness required a conversation that never took place and was not offered for. But she did not carry the weight of the woman's campaign either because carrying it would have cost her something she needed for other purposes. She let it go the way you let go of things that have already done their damage and have no further claim on your attention. The garden came in that autumn with the improbable generosity of things that have been attended to through difficulty and have decided on the other side of it to justify the attention. The tomatoes were the measure of it. The single section that had thrived through the summer drought was still producing in October when by any reasonable agricultural logic it should have finished weeks earlier, still bearing fruit past the point where such things were expected to persist. Clara brought the first ripe one in on the afternoon of the wedding. Will looked at it on the kitchen table and said it was the best tomato he had seen on this property in 3 years. Noah said it was the best tomato in Wyoming and possibly in the entire world. Cole said it was just a tomato and ate his share with an expression of involuntary appreciation that told the true story. Lily declared it the wedding tomato, and this name stuck. And in subsequent years, whenever anything unexpectedly good arrived at an unexpected moment, the children called it a wedding tomato. And Clara was never sure whether they understood all of what they meant by that, but she understood it completely. The garden became Clara's particular project in the years that followed. She expanded it in the second year, pulling the perimeter outward into soil that had not been worked since Margaret planted the original beds. She grew vegetables in quantities sufficient to feed the family and the ranch hands and to send surplus to town on market days. In the third year, she planted a section of Margaret's original herb arrangement from the seed packets she had found pressed between recipe cards labeled in Margaret's handwriting with the particular specificity of someone who intended the information to be useful. She planted them in the same position Margaret had used against the south wall where they got the most light. They grew. Will watched her do all of this. He watched her with the specific attention that he brought to things he valued, which was not the dramatic attention of new feeling, but the sustained attention of a man who had chosen someone and intended the choosing to be visible every day. The sign went up in the fourth year. Will carved it himself from a piece of hardwood he had been saving since the first winter, a dense and close-grained piece that held the cutting tool the way good wood holds an edge when you know how to use it. He worked on it in the evenings after the children were settled in the lamplight at the kitchen table while Clara read or mended or worked through the accounts beside him. She knew he was working on it. He did not tell her what it said until it was finished. Not for sale. Two words cut deep and clean the letters without ornamentation, but with a precision that made them entirely legible from the road. He mounted it at the fence post at the end of the drive on a Saturday morning in spring with all 5 children present because he wanted them to be there, and Clara standing beside him in the May light that was different from the October light that had marked their wedding but was its own version of particular and good. People asked about the sign. Travelers asked because they had never seen it before, and its meaning was not immediately apparent. Cattle buyers from back east asked because they assumed it referred to the ranch, which was by then a going concern generating the kind of consistent revenue that made buyers interested, and which Will declined with the same 2 words the sign used. The locals understood it differently. Some of them said it referred to the ranch, and they were right. Some of them said it referred to the garden which Clara had protected through every drought and frost and late-season pest with the focused intensity of someone who had learned that living things required advocacy, and they were right also. The old-timers, the ones who had been on the platform at Millstone Creek Station in May of 1883, and who had watched Will Calhoun tell an agency representative in an assembled crowd that the woman he had chosen was worth more than their assessment of her, said that the sign meant something about that day, about the fact that some things once claimed and defended could not be taken back. They were all right. The years passed, the way years passed in Wyoming, which was to say not gently, but with a completeness that left its marks on everything, and made those marks into the record of a life. The ranch grew, the children grew. The garden grew past its original perimeter and became something Margaret had not planned and could not have imagined, and which bore in its current form the evidence of 2 women's hands, the original layout and the expansion built upon it, the old beds and the new ones, the herbs from the recipe box seeds and the tomatoes that had learned over years to grow past the season that common sense assigned them. Ethan took over the ranch operation in increments, 1 pasture at a time, 1 season at a time, the way you gave responsibility to someone who had always been capable of it and simply needed to be given the room. He was steady in the way his father was steady, with the addition of his mother's dark eyes and a patience that was his own, developed in the particular school of a childhood spent caring more than his share. Cole studied law in Cheyenne, which surprised no one who had watched him conduct his 9-year-old interrogation of a territorial court official and found the arguments insufficient. He came home at Christmas every year without fail, and every Christmas he argued with Ethan about at least one thing of consequence and agreed with him about everything that mattered, which was how it worked between them and always would. Owen found his voice in the fullest sense. He wrote. He told the stories of the people around him and the land under his feet and the sky above it with the precision and weight that came from years of learning that words were valuable and should be used accordingly. He published in the territorial newspaper first, then in papers back east that paid attention to things coming out of Wyoming that deserved attention. He dedicated his first collection of essays to 2 women, naming them both, and the people who knew the family understood the dedication completely. Noah grew up with the same radical openness he had been born with and became the person in any room that other people wanted to tell their stories to, which was a gift he had not manufactured and which served everyone around him well. Lily grew up knowing she had almost not grown up, which gave her a specific and practical relationship with her own life that manifested as a cheerful refusal to waste any of it on things that did not deserve it. She was the most like Margaret, people said, and Clara heard this the way she heard everything about Margaret, which was with the warmth of someone who had come to love a person through their effects on the people they had shaped through the recipe box, in the curtains, in the herb garden, and the 5 children who carried her forward. Daniel Hayes came back to Wyoming. Not immediately and not directly, but in the way that rivers return to the places they came from, following the logic of the land beneath them. He arrived in the territory when he was 23 with a surveying qualification and a horse, and the intention of making something of himself in country that had been kind to his sister, And he did exactly that. And he brought his family out to the Calhoun Ranch every summer for 30 years afterward. And his children grew up knowing their Aunt Clara and their Uncle Will and their cousins, the Calhoun children, as the fixed point of summer, the place that was always there. On evenings when the light was right, long after the children had their own households, and the ranch had settled into the comfortable productivity of something fully realized, Clara and Will sat on the back porch. They had the two cups. Margaret's tin cup, with its scratched flower, which Will had reclaimed for daily use the daisy worn to suggestion by years of handling, but still legible to anyone who knew to look for it. And the cup Owen had given Clara on that evening in the kitchen after Lily's fever broke, dented with years of use. Now the two cups always kept together on the kitchen windowsill, side by side, two women's histories held in the same place on the same shelf. They drank their coffee and talked about the day's work and the grandchildren's latest developments, and whether the South field was asking for more water or simply complaining. They talked about nothing in particular and everything that mattered in the way of people who have been talking to each other for long enough that the conversation was less a series of exchanges than a continuous process, a river that had been running long enough to know its own bed. Sometimes when the light came in at the particular autumn angle across the garden, Clara thought about a train platform in May, and a tall man with gray eyes and no false warmth about him whatsoever, who had looked at her with a direct and uncomplicated question. She thought about 5 children, 5 different shapes of grief, 5 different roads to the same place. She thought about what it meant to choose a family and be chosen by one to find that family was not something that happened to you through the accident of blood, but something you built deliberately and daily through the ordinary acts of showing up and staying and fighting for what mattered. She thought about the footnote in an agency file, about practical considerations before sentiment, about the word barren spoken in a Hartford parlor by someone who believed she understood what Clara was worth and who had been in the most complete and documented way possible wrong. "What are you thinking about?" Will asked the way he had been asking for 20 years. "The garden," Clara said, which meant a dozen other things, and he knew all of them because he had been there for all of them and had chosen to stay for all of them, and that choosing was the whole story. "Still growing," he said. "Still growing," she agreed. In the garden behind them, past every season that should have ended it, through every drought that should have finished it, the tomatoes were red and heavy on the vine, not because the conditions were ideal. The conditions in Wyoming were rarely ideal, but because someone had decided to plant them and tend them and refused to let them go, and because life, given the smallest consistent reason to persist, will persist past every reasonable expectation. The sign at the end of the drive stood in the evening light, the letters still clean and deep after 20 years, still legible from the road, still saying the thing it had always said. Not to the cattle buyers from the east. Not to the neighbors who had long since stopped wondering at it, but to whoever needed to hear it, to whoever arrived at the end of a long road and looked up and needed to know that some things once freely chosen and faithfully kept were not available for any price. Not for sale, not the ranch, not the garden, not the family built on the back porch of a decision made in good faith and honored every day afterward. Not this life, not ever.